This is Anarchast.
Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet, coming in again from Acapulco, Mexico. A nice morning here, and we're talking with a person I'm really excited to talk to, James Turk. He's the founder of Goldmoney.com in 2001. He also is the author of a book called The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, something that really jives with what I do with the Dollar Vigilante, where our theme is surviving and prospering during and after the collapse of the dollar. So we're definitely on the same page on those things, and we're on the same page on anarchy as well. He's an anarchist, and he's coming in from London. Great to have you on, James.
Thanks, Jeff. It's really great to be with you.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. And first question I ask all first-time guests on Anarchast is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. I think I've been an anarchist all my life, and probably first realized it when I was still pretty young and in school. I started sort of searching around for answers and stuff, and my sister had Atlas Shrugged in her library, and I actually picked up Atlas Shrugged and read it when I was 14, and that enabled me to start seeing how the world really works and putting things together, and my own little perspective within it. And then I read Atlas Shrugged again back in when I was about 22, and I read it the third time when I was in my early 40s. But it really goes back to, as far as I can remember for all practical purposes. Yeah, I had an interesting discussion a little while ago with Doug Casey on this point. And, he was saying that maybe people are just wired differently. Some think in terms of self-reliance, keep your distance from the state, whereas there are other people who are the exact opposite. They want to depend on the state, and they're concerned or worried or afraid to be self-reliant. I don't know what it is, but I found in my experiences that some people see the world very differently from other people, and unfortunately we anarcho-capitalists are in a minority, but hopefully we will become more and more recognized as time goes on, because I think the answers to a liberty in which a world in which human liberty thrives is one that's based on anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, I agree. And you're another person who was brought into this world a little bit by Ayn Rand. It's a big book to read so many times. I've actually never gotten through it yet myself, just because it's such a large book. But funnily enough, we founded a place in Chile called Gulch, which is about what she wrote about in that book. But I haven't fully finished reading the book yet, but I'm looking forward to maybe having some time this year to finally read it. So you grew up in the U.S., is that correct?
Yes, I did. My father was born in Europe, but I was born in the States. Went to school in the States, but I spent most of my adult life outside of the U.S. You mentioned Gulch, and one of the things that I took from Atlas Shrugged is that everybody has to prepare their own Gulch, and I've never really taken it literally. I've taken it more figuratively, in the sense that the world is what it is, and we have to live within it. And how do you create your own Gulch, recognizing that the world may not be your cup of tea, it may not be the perfect place that you would like it or envision it to be, but we still have to strive to create our own Gulch in the world in which we live. It doesn't necessarily have to be geographic, although I do recommend that geography is a very important part of one of the components that you have to decide as to how you want to live your life.
Yeah, and so do you live now in the UK?
Yeah, my wife is British. I'm a UK resident. I spend a lot of time in Spain. I'm 66 this year, and so a little bit of retirement. And I like to think that I'm a golfer and focus on my golf game every now and then. So I do that down in Spain. But I live in just in the outskirts of London. From where I'm speaking, at the moment, and as you can tell from the weather outside, typical London weather.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've decided to create your own Gulch where you live, in two of the most oppressive countries on earth right now, the U.S. and the U.K. How do you find living in the U.K.?
London is a wonderful city. It, along with a couple of other cities, are one of my favorites in the world. And it's basically just a question of setting up your life in a way that you want to live it. And like I say, I try to keep my distance from the state. But I've got my London residency. They have a very attractive program over here called non-domiciliation. In UK, you can be non-domiciled even though you're living in the UK. Because I don't have a UK passport, I'm a non-dom, as they call it, and that's very attractive.
Yeah, that's great. I do similar things called the perpetual traveler theory, or the prior taxpayer theory, which is even better. And so, yeah, I don't really live anywhere per se. I don't live in Mexico. I'm not a Mexican resident. I'm not here enough days of the year to become one. And I try to make sure that I don't stay here enough days to become one. So I actually am a resident of other countries that don't even have income taxes. So that's another nice way to live. One of the things that you founded that I really love, it's a service that I'm a client of, Goldmoney. You founded that in 2001, very early in what I perceive as the dollar collapse becoming reality. And that really probably was the first year where the dollar started to really look like it was going to be headed that way after all the changes after 9/11 and all the spending and all the debt of the U.S. government. For people who don't know, Goldmoney is a way you can buy gold over the internet and store it in various different locations, which is something that I really recommend to people, because as these governments continue to collapse, especially the Western governments, their tax revenues are going to continue to decline. You just look at what's going on in France right now. They're trying to increase taxes, and all it's doing is making their richest people leave, including Gerard Depardieu, who went to Russia and became a citizen there in a record amount of time of a few days. But perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why you founded Goldmoney.com and how that ties into your philosophy and ideology on life.
Yeah, well, it comes back to the point about self-reliance. I had a very interesting experience and the realization that I wanted to create my own company, and it goes back to my father created his own company, so again, maybe there's something in my genes or in my blood. But when I first graduated from school, I joined Chase Manhattan Bank, and I specifically was looking for two things. One is that I wanted to live and travel abroad, and secondly, I wanted to focus on finance, or international finance, which I actually studied in school. And it was a great opportunity for me, but my mother always used to say, well, you don't want to leave the bank because your job is so secure. And I remember when I first joined the bank, one of the things that they said was an advantage for working with it, that they didn't lay off any people during the Great Depression. Now, both my mother and my father lived through the Great Depression when they were in their early 20s. And so it left a big mark on them, and I guess indirectly, it also left a mark on myself and my three sisters, growing up in the late 1940s and 1950s, because, they would relate their experiences to us. So anyway, going back to the point, my mother always said, well, don't leave a bank because you're so secure. But eventually came to realize that you're not secure working for a big institution. You're only secure when you work for yourself and can rely on your own abilities, because you can't fire yourself. Whereas in a big bank, if some guy came in and decided to get rid of a whole department, regardless of what your performance was, you might end up getting a pink slip along with everybody else in the department. So when I finally realized that, I pretty much decided to set myself on working for myself. And it was sort of a transition. After Chase, I worked with a top commodity trader in North America before making a halfway step by contracting with the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority to work for them for a period of time. It was a contract assignment, and I could have stayed there longer had I wanted to. But by the late 1980s, I'd had pretty much enough and wanted to do other things. I was also starting to think more clearly about, or not clearly, but more closely about what I wanted to do with Goldmoney, because the ideas for Goldmoney go back to the 1970s, and I always wanted to build it if the opportunity presented itself. So, after the Abu Dhabi, I held a number of different positions, again on contractual arrangements, and then started Goldmoney in the late 1990s, and it's worked very well, and obviously I'm very pleased with the results that we've achieved. And that's not just me, it's that we've got about 52 people now in a variety of different countries, making Goldmoney the success that it is.
That's great. We actually have a very similar background because I started working at a bank in Canada as well. And I had this very same experience. I started up a company called stockhouse.com, which still is the largest financial website in Canada, around 1994. And I actually started it while I was working at the bank, and I actually gave my bank manager stock tips in exchange for not really having to work too much. And I basically just built Stockhouse while I was still working at the bank. And finally, one day, they actually came and they wanted to promote me to be bank manager, which was a big deal at the bank, of course. But it only paid about $40,000 a year. And as soon as they offered me that job, I actually just sat there for a second and said, you know what? I think it's better I just quit. and they were just in shock. He was a young guy, I was about 24 at the time, being offered bank manager position. And I said, I think I'm going to try doing my own thing. And a bunch of the old ladies from the bank all huddled around, and they all came up to me and they said, are you sure? This is crazy. You have such a secure job with the bank and you get free dental. And I said, well, what's dental? Like teeth cleaning once a year for $50 or $80? Like, I think I can figure that one out on my own. And yeah, that was the best decision I ever made, was leaving that sort of institution. I kind of feel the same way as you about it. And I don't think as secure as people think. I think these banks nowadays are all a function of the state. They really probably wouldn't exist without the state. Of course, all the things they're allowed to do are made possible from the state, including creating currency. And so as this currency collapse goes on, I think banks will be one of the worst places you'll want to work.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think banking was much different back in the 1970s when I was in it, in large part because, we were riding the crest of the wave. The American post-World War II success financially and globally. But it's been pretty much all downhill since then for a variety of different reasons. The U.S. living beyond its means, banks getting into bed with the state. And there's another thing from a geopolitical point of view. Back then, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was still going on. The U.S. had a nuclear umbrella that would protect anybody who was its ally. And as a consequence, a lot of countries around the world, were part of that alliance to remain under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. But you don't have the threat today like you did back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with the demise of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the U.S. has moved in the wrong direction. We should have paid, our Americans or politicians in the States as well as the American people should have paid more attention, I think, to President Eisenhower's farewell address to the country, where he said, beware of the military-industrial complex. And I would add to that, beware of the military-industrial financial complex. I think they've taken over the country to a large extent to the detriment of individuals who live there.
Yeah, I agree, and it's just getting worse and worse. So it's becoming a welfare state now. So many people are on welfare. There's actually 11 states in the U.S. where there's more people receiving government benefits than actually working. And that's not really a recipe for success in the future. And so there's going to be some interesting times there. And you wrote the book, The Coming Dollar Collapse, in 2004. Are you going to be doing any updates to that book, or do you have any thoughts or things you'd like to add on the coming demise of the dollar, where we're at right now?
Yeah, the book was originally titled The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, and then we did an update in 2008. Doubleday, which published the book, wanted to change the title The Collapse of the Dollar, because the gold price had risen so much between 2004 when the book came out and 2008 when we did the paperback version. But John Rubina, who's my co-author, and I had looked at it, and the book still sells well on Amazon, and it sort of withstood the test of time. The things that we identified in that book are as valid today as they were back then, with the possible exception that the banks and the financial industry are no longer the short sale that they were back then, and that the housing bubble did finally pop as we expected it would pop. But in terms of the underlying logic of what we were saying in that book, that gold has been money for 5,000 years. It's inevitably going to return to the center of global commerce when people realize that this 4-decade experiment with fiat currencies is going badly and is eventually going to blow up, which anyone can learn from monetary history. Those basic premises of the book are still valid today, and I think that's why the book still sells well on Amazon. So, I've talked to John from time to time about, whether we should do some updates or something, but there's really not much to update. It's all pretty much there in that book, and it's just a question of waiting for it all to unfold. And I guess that's the interesting thing. If you'd asked me back in 2004, would we have made it, here to 2013 without the dollar collapsing? And I probably would have said, maybe there was a 15 or 20% chance that yes, we would make it, because simply the future is unknowable and you can't predict how events will unfold. But I'm amazed by how politicians and governments have been able to kick that can down the road as long as they have. But when you control the media, you can control people's thinking, and people still think that the dollar is money. But I like to make the point, Jeff, that we're in a bubble, and I call it the fiat currency bubble. And it's a bubble because people are saying and doing things that don't tie in with monetary history. And this is a characteristic of any bubble. So if you look, for example, at the internet bubble, the common conventional wisdom at that time was that profits don't matter, only market share does. And we saw that was pretty stupid after the bubble burst. And then in the real estate bubble, people were saying housing prices only go up, they don't go down. After the event, that seemed pretty stupid because we see that housing prices do indeed go down. And today everybody's saying that the dollar is money. It's not money, it's only a money substitute. And I think when this fiat currency bubble pops, which I've sort of thought it's maybe going to be the 2013 to 2015 timeframe, based on my analysis of cash flow and of governments and a number of other points, maybe it's going to be in this time frame. But when this bubble pops, regardless whether it's in the next couple of years or 5 years down the road, that people will say, oh yeah, we were pretty stupid thinking that the dollar was money. It's not money, it's only a money substitute, because it's fundamentally different. Money comes from hard work. It doesn't come from the printing press. It doesn't get created out of thin air. And that's why gold and silver have served as money for thousands of years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I as well in 2004 wasn't expecting to be here in 2013 and the dollar still really be around in the form that it's currently in. So yeah, these things tend to take a while to unfold. But as Doug Casey says, once they do start to really collapse, it'll happen very fast. When you say the dollar collapsed, do you actually foresee it going basically to zero, completely collapsing, or are you talking more about or are you talking about hyperinflation? Maybe you can explain what you foresee.
Yeah, I basically see it going to essentially zero, where it doesn't buy next to anything. There's only two alternatives that the government can do, the U.S. government, that is. And this is basically true for all governments around the world because they're all in a similar situation. The politicians have made so many promises. Those promises cannot possibly be fulfilled. There's just not enough wealth being generated to take away from the wealth-producing sector of the economy to give it to the tax eaters, whatever the tax eaters section of the economy happens to be. So either those promises are going to have to be broken, and the U.S. is going to have to default in some respects on those promises, or they're going to fulfill those promises with dollars that are basically worth nothing. These are the lessons from monetary history. There is no other alternative. The present situation is unsustainable, and when something's unsustainable, eventually it's going to have to give. The other alternative, of course, is that we go back to where we should be. We read the Constitution. We recognize the problems with the framers of the Constitution faced after the collapse of the continental currency after winning the War of Independence, and go back to a system that was more or less, though it had some flaws from a monetary point of view, it was more or less working pretty well, for 170 or 180 years, and go back to that system where gold and silver are the center, and gold and silver control the amount of money that politicians can create. So can we go back there? Yeah, we can. I think Ron Paul could have brought us back in the right direction. Put a 4 or 5 year plan into place and work toward it to go back to sound money. After all, not only did the country do that after the collapse of the Continental in the 1780s, but they also did it after the war between the states when they created the greenback currency. They had a 10-year plan to resume what they called resumption, going back to a gold standard, and it worked. We could do the same thing again if we only had the leaders and the politicians recognizing that they're heading toward the cliff and want to turn around and go back in the right direction, learning the lessons of history, and appreciating the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution and what they put into that document. That basically you have a sound money operating as a common currency within a unified market, but the money comes from the market itself. It doesn't get created by government. It's gold or it's silver.
Yeah, I wonder if any of these countries, China or Russia, do you think any of them might eventually back their currency by gold?
It's an interesting question. Depending, how events unfold, I would expect some countries will try that. Whether they will maintain the confidence of the people who are using that currency remains to be seen. There are a couple aspects to having a sound money. Not only is it gold and silver, but you have to have it in a country where the rule of law is respected, where property rights are respected. And China could very well go back to some type of a gold standard. It has the resources and the power to do it, but it doesn't have the historic rule of law. So it's questionable whether or not China could create a new reserve currency. But there's a more fundamental question that you're actually raising here, Jeff. Do we need the state to create money? I don't think we do. History has shown that the only thing the state is good at is waging war. When it comes to goods and services, it's always much better from the private market. And I mean a private market in terms of a true free market sense, not the lip service we give to private markets and free markets today, or private sector and free markets today, because the banks today, for example, don't really operate in a true free competitive marketplace. They operate under a cartel that's been sanctioned by the state. But it's possible that in the future, maybe one or two countries might go the right way. They will have to go the right way because when fiat currency collapses, they're going to be looking for alternatives, and the only logical alternative in the collapse of fiat currency is to go back to gold and silver. But you can't predict how it's going to unfold, and that's why I always like to say that we as individuals have to just make sure that ourselves and our families are protected. And you mentioned before about the PT, the permanent travel or perpetuate travel. I was reading Harry Schultz newsletter back in the 1980s when he first started developing that concept. And I think it's a concept that everybody should really be thinking about and taking seriously, because when it comes to the real world, the future is unpredictable and unknowable. And the only thing that we can do as individuals to make certain that we sleep well at night, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day, you don't want to have any worries about an uncertain future, is that you diversify as much as possible. And in that regard, I think global diversification, or being a PT, or achieving the objectives of the PT, as Harry Schultz originally started laying them out, and as others have continued to develop and refine the concept, I think is a very important goal that people should be striving to achieve and working toward.
I agree, and that's what we write about a lot at the Dollar Vigilante newsletter, is how to live a PT-style lifestyle and how to diversify. I think in the next few years, it's going to be a very dangerous time for both your capital and your own self and your family.
Yeah, by the way,
there's really no way to know what these governments are going to do, and again, as history shows, as they continue to collapse, they start to do more and more crazier things. So it's really important to do that, and of course, we offer something at tdvpassports.com to get foreign passports, and in countries that really are much less dangerous than these giant Western bureaucracies and governments. And but going back to your point about the market should create money, I agree, of course. And correct me if I'm wrong, didn't goldmoney.com used to offer ways for you to actually pay directly with gold money? And did you stop doing that?
Well, in every country except Jersey, which is where we operate. And we did that because of the various hurdles that are being imposed by various governments around the world, making it increasingly difficult for competitive currency to compete with currencies that are issued by the state. But we're continuing to look at ways in which we can go back to our original vision, which is that gold and silver can circulate once again in cross-border commerce by individuals on a voluntary basis without force. That's the essential nature of a free market. People cooperating with one another to improve their situation in life. That's the backbone behind Adam Smith's invisible hand. And what we are ultimately aiming to do in Goldmoney is to try to achieve that objective. But like I was saying earlier on, it's a little bit difficult given the growing power of the state worldwide. So we have to operate legally within the rules and the laws, and because the regulations became so heavy in so many countries, we've temporarily suspended that, but we're putting our thinking caps on as to how we can still offer that service at some point in time in the future. We've been examining and looking at other alternatives.
That's great, yeah, and that'd be a great thing if gold money became like a money and you could actually just pay for things with it. I believe recently you, on gold money, you had something to do with Bitcoin, some sort of poll or something. Do you have any thoughts on Bitcoin?
Well, you know, I've been interviewed a couple times about Bitcoin, and, you know, gold's got a 5,000-year history. Bitcoin's got a 2-year history. I don't want to disparage Bitcoin because I think it's very creative, and there are a lot of very interesting developments in it. But there's still some fundamental differences. You know, gold is a tangible asset that you can hold in your hand. And you know, once I said that Bitcoin isn't tangible, and a lot of Bitcoin advocates came back to me and said, well, it may not be corporeal, it may not have a body, but it is tangible in the sense that it's, you know, in computer code. You know, and there's an element of truth to that. But you know, can they crack that code? You know, what is the risk of having Bitcoin? How do you get into Bitcoin? You know, from fiat currency into a Bitcoin. There's still a lot of issues with it, but you know, it's still early days for Bitcoin, and I think it's going to be around for a long time. So we've been studying and watching Bitcoin to see whether it's something that might make sense for gold money or gold money customers at some date, which is actually an important point. You know, in the Austrian school of economics, Mises said that the customer is king, or the consumer is king. And you know, we take that comment to heart in Gold Money, so we listen always to our customers and their feedback. If Bitcoin were an important aspect of their financial future or their financial situation, you know, we would more seriously consider in some way enabling an exchange between gold and Bitcoin. But you know, again, these things have to be studied to make sure that given the world in which we live, an opportunity can be done, you know, legally and in compliance with the laws where we operate.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about Bitcoin is that it's pretty unregulatable, and so that's one of the real hopes for Bitcoin that I have is that, for example, I know with gold money, I know that in the Netherlands government made it illegal for people to actually open a gold money account, whereas with something like Bitcoin, they wouldn't actually be able to do that because there'd be no actual central source for them to stop people from doing that. So yeah, I'm sure you're dealing all the time with governments and regulations, and it must be just a nightmare.
Yeah, the Dutch government didn't actually make it illegal. What they were saying is that the people who lived in Holland were to be regulated, you know, by the Dutch regulator, which meant that we were supposed to be regulated. And if we were regulated by the Dutch regulator, we would have to give up the names and addresses of the people who were living in Holland. In Jersey, however, the privacy laws did not enable that type of disclosure. So we were in a bit of a rock and a hard place situation. And what we ultimately decided to do was voluntarily close down Holland, in the sense that anybody who was anybody who lived in Holland, whether they were Dutch or any other nationality, if they had a Dutch address, they would not be able to open a holding in gold money. So what we did is we ultimately closed all of the customers who had a Dutch address. We contacted each individual and explained the situation, said that we don't want to disclose, you know, their information, and we didn't want to violate laws where we were operating, and that they had a choice of taking physical metal or cashing in and receiving currency. The choice was up to them. We just saw that as the way that was really in our customers' best interest, not just in the Dutch customers, but for customers everywhere, so that they would know, you know, what our principles are and how we operate when we're faced in a tough situation like that.
I see. And yeah, it's very interesting. I really like gold money. It definitely jives with what we're telling people to do, which is get into precious metals and diversify them in different countries, because you never know which country is going to do something, tax it or confiscate it or do something. You never know what these governments are going to do. So to be safest, it's best to have your precious metals diversified around the world. How many vaults do you have now? 5
countries, and we're using 4 different companies as well. We use first of all, the countries are Canada, UK, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and we just added Singapore. And we're actually having a special promotion on the Singapore vault with reduced buy fees or reduced metal fees if you're switching from one vault to the Singapore vault, and that continues until January 31st. And then we have 4 different companies, Viamet and Renus, which are Swiss companies, Brinks, Canada, and then also G4S PLC, which is a UK company. So you have a choice of different vaults and different companies located in different countries around the world. And again, given the maxim that you want to diversify as much as possible, I'm sure that we're going to be adding more vaults and maybe even more vaulting companies in the future as well as we continue to grow and develop the business.
That's great, and definitely a big supporter. We're going to have links to Goldmoney to sign up at Goldmoney down below in the notes, and we'll also have links to your books. And while I have you here, though, let me ask you for your gold price prediction for the next few years.
You know, we were talking earlier that this has gone on much longer than I expected. You know, the dollar has not yet collapsed. But the important point is not so much the price, but whether gold is undervalued or whether gold is overvalued. You know, the key to successful portfolio management is you're constantly shifting assets that are overvalued, moving those out of the portfolio, and using your wealth to acquire undervalued assets. And this is true for both components of your portfolio. It's true for the investment part of your portfolio, but it's also true for the liquidity, or what people generally call the cash part of their portfolio. You know, when it comes to bullion, you have to compare bullion versus the other types of liquidity that are out there. You know, the dollar, the Swiss franc, the euro, British pound, Japanese yen, and all of the others. And, you know, gold's up 12 years in a row against the U.S. dollar. So, you know, your first impression might be that gold is overvalued. But the reality is that the dollar is being debased as rapidly as the gold price is rising. So the net result is that gold is really almost as undervalued as it was 5 or 6 years ago. And as a consequence, it still has a long way to go. Now, what I try to do when it comes to, you know, my writings and giving advice and speaking at conferences or interviews like this one is explain to people that gold is still undervalued. And I do this in using 2 formulas, which I've written quite a bit about over the years. One is my fear index, and the other one is my Goldmoney index. And I use mathematical formulas because what that does is it eliminates the emotional aspects of any equation, and it also forces you to apply rigorously an analysis that's consistent with, you know, gold's position relative to the past, and you can analyze then whether, you know, the dollar is in a bubble or gold is in a bubble, or you know, where the relative value is. And clearly, gold is still undervalued. And by my Goldmoney index, I determined that the fair value of gold today, based on a formula that's been very reliable in the past, is about $11,000 per ounce. Now, typically, when you're in a bull market, assets go from undervaluation until at some point in time when you become overvalued. And I fully expect gold at some point in time in the future to become overvalued, and maybe more than $11,000 per ounce. But it ultimately all depends upon what central banks do. You know, if the central banks create a deflation, maybe the overvaluation will come at a lower price. If the central banks create a hyperinflation, which is what I think is going to happen, maybe the overvaluation will come at a much higher price. Or maybe this. Maybe there won't be any price for gold in terms of the dollar, just like there wasn't any price for gold in terms of the German Reichsmark in the 1920s or the Zimbabwe dollar in, you know, a few years ago, because the currency totally collapses. And I guess where I'm leading this to, Jeff, is that my expectation is when gold becomes overvalued in the future, you'll know it's overvalued because gold will once again be used as currency. You know, people are actually going to be using it again in commerce. It may not be commerce where people are using gold coins hand to hand. It might be a digital gold currency like we've created in Goldmoney, where you're clicking gold from your iPhone to somebody else's iPhone. But you know, only time will tell how the currency evolves in the future. But I think the key message here is that despite the fact that gold has done as well as it has over these past 12 years, we still have a long way to go on the upside before gold becomes overvalued. And what I've been recommending to individuals, and I continue to recommend that, is, you know, every month just use a cost averaging program to accumulate gold or accumulate silver. Because what that does, if you follow the discipline of buying the fixed amount on the same day of every month, this cost averaging program is enabling to you acquire an undervalued asset without having to worry about all the noise that we get from time to time by reading the newspapers or listening to the TV, which can distract you from where the value is and what you want to be doing with your portfolio.
Yeah, that's great advice. And one of the things I tell people is I don't even really care what the price of gold is in dollars. I just care that I own gold. I think it's more of a protection at this point. I'm not really looking to become rich by owning gold, but if I happen to become rich by owning gold, that's fine. But I really just, it's a very dangerous time over the next few years. We're going to have currencies collapse. We're going to have probably hyperinflation, as you said, which will lead to currency collapse. And a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. And so it's excellent advice, especially for people who don't have a lot of money right now, just every month buy a certain amount. And I think you can do that through your site. Is that correct? Do you have a monthly program?
Yeah, you can do it through our site fairly easily. And you know, you're raising a very important point because gold does not create wealth. It's a sterile asset. You know, it doesn't generate cash flow. It doesn't have a balance sheet or a management team. You know, money doesn't create wealth unless you take risks with it. You know, a dollar doesn't create wealth for you unless you deposit it in a bank and earn interest, or lend the dollars, or use the dollars to make an investment. And in that sense, gold is no different from any other form of currency. But what happens when the gold price is rising, wealth is already created by somebody's hard work. And they're holding a fiat currency to preserve their, or to hold their purchasing power until they're ready to use that purchasing power to buy some good or service. So when the gold price is rising, what you're actually seeing is a transfer of wealth out of fiat currency, you know, the hands of people who own fiat currency, into the hands of people who own gold. So you might become wealthier by owning gold, but gold itself is not a wealth-creating mechanism. It's more or less like a place marker, just like any other money, to preserve purchasing power. And when you have a gold bull market, the purchasing power is moving from fiat currencies into gold, and you want to be in that side of the equation, owning gold, as long as gold remains overvalued until at some point in time in the future gold becomes overvalued. We can't predict when it will happen, but we know when that moment will arrive. Will arise by looking at mathematical formulas, and as I say, when you're spending gold as a form of currency, it's probably overvalued at that moment in time.
Yeah, I generally agree. And what I've been saying to people is if you're looking to invest in things which may make you a lot of wealth, I've been saying to look at gold stocks, which are really undervalued compared to gold. Do you look at gold stocks at all, or are you just mostly interested in the bullion?
Well, years ago, I was very much involved in the gold stocks, but the last 12 years, with Goldmoney, I've really been just focusing on the bullion side, simply because, that's my particular speciality more so than the mining stocks. But, I do follow the mining stocks to a certain extent, and, I apply various valuation methods to them just like everybody else does, and, they're unbelievably cheap compared to historical standards. And one of the things that the market doesn't like is extreme undervaluations or extreme overvaluations, regardless of what the asset is. So my expectation is that eventually the mining stocks will do much better than they have been doing. But it really is quite perplexing to see what the mining stocks have done and how they haven't been bad, but compared to the market as a whole. But compared to gold, they've underperformed what one would expect the mining stocks to be doing, given this bull market that we've been seeing in gold these past 12 years.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of the problem has been that costs have been rising just as fast as the price of gold, which is something you pointed out before. So a lot of these gold stocks haven't been the hedge or the leverage that you would expect so far. And I think partially that's probably because I don't think people still today believe in this gold bull market. I think, they're confused by it. They think it's irrational. If you talk to people like Ben Bernanke or anyone like those people, or anyone on CNBC or any media, which is mostly all state propaganda for the most part, they'll all talk about how gold's not a good investment and that sort of a thing. So I think once we really see things get to the next level, which probably could happen in the next year or two, with gold going up dramatically again, it'll probably start to awaken more people, and then probably, there's no guarantee, drive people into the gold stocks as well. But there's really no way to know. But like I said, it's just it's very important not to keep all your assets in fiat currencies right now. That's for sure.
Yeah, but remember, gold is not an investment. Gold is money. Gold is, Warren Buffett was half correct when he said that gold was not an investment. It doesn't generate cash flow. So you cannot apply to gold a standard investment criteria technique, because there is no cash flow to measure. As I was saying, all you're seeing is when gold price rises is the purchasing power from people who own fiat currency moving to the people who own gold. Gold is money, and we have to recognize that as such. The mining stocks, on the other hand, are an investment. They do generate cash flow if things are going well. But, there's another thing that the mining stocks have to worry about. In a world that's becoming increasingly statist, and I think the world has been moving in that direction pretty much the whole 20th century and to the present. Mining companies are setting targets. I wouldn't put it past governments to confiscate a mine. It's happened many, many times throughout history, even recently. Look at Venezuela is just one example where assets were confiscated because there was no respect for private property. So you have risks with the mining companies you don't have with bullion, and I think that leads to another important point. The mining companies sort of shot themselves in the foot by creating this paper product called the ETF. The gold community is not a big community, and given the fact that a lot of mining companies blew up because of hedging, not too many years ago, or took big losses because of hedging, a lot of people who would be inclined to buy the mining stocks said, well, I don't want to worry about management doing something stupid. I'll just buy an ETF instead. So a lot of the money that would otherwise gone into the mining stocks, I think, has gone into the gold ETF, and that itself has taken a lot of the demand away from the mining shares. So that might be another contributing factor why the mining shares have done as poorly as they have over the past 10 years, or 8 years, as the ETF has grown.
Yeah, and it's really ridiculous to buy an ETF if what you believe in about gold is that it is money and that it is something that is apart from the financial system, which is in a state of collapse. To actually invest in gold through the financial system in paper gold is completely ridiculous, and we'll probably see a lot of people start to realize that over the coming years as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because if you're going to buy gold, you have to ask yourself, why are you buying it? Do you want it because it's a safe haven? In which case you have to buy physical gold. It's a tangible asset. And that gives you the safe haven status because there's no counterparty risk when you own something physical. On the other hand, if you want exposure to the gold price and want to attempt to profit by fluctuations in the gold price, you can look at an ETF or a futures contract or an options. But I don't recommend trading. I leave that to the speculators and the professional traders. The individuals should be thinking about how do they protect themselves against the future, and why gold is an important component of the portfolio. And if you follow the logic, you're going to say that, well, the ETF doesn't give me that. Futures contracts don't give me that. Only physical gold gives me that, and therefore they should be buying physical gold. Or, like I've been saying all along, physical silver, because I'm probably even a little bit more bullish on silver than I am on gold, just simply because silver itself is, even though gold is cheap, silver is even cheap compared to gold, based on historical comparisons.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I live just down the road from a good friend of yours, Hugo Salinas Price, who's a big silver proponent, and he's been trying to get silver put back into the monetary system here in Mexico. And he agrees with you on that one. And I'm pretty agnostic. I just, like I said, I buy both just to protect myself, and I just want to hold that because I'm pretty sure that I'll be able to survive this coming financial system collapse by having a significant portion of my assets in precious metals and having them diversified, because you never know what's going to happen. Of course, in the U.S., they confiscated gold in 1933, so it's not beyond the imagination that governments might do that again as well. So it's very dangerous times, but it's great to have products like Goldmoney where you can easily invest and diversify your gold around the world, because it's a lot easier than getting on a plane and going to Singapore or going to Canada or the UK or any of the other vaults around the world and doing it. And so that's great to have that product. And but I think we're getting pretty close to ending our time here. So I really want to thank you again, James, for coming on with us. And I believe you have a blog if you want to point any people to that. And if there's anything else you want to say, go ahead and say it.
Yeah, I have a blog where I write from time to time, fgmr.com, which was basically my old newsletter, which is now available for free, but I don't write to it too often, but you can sign up for articles. But most of the stuff that I do is really on the Goldmoney site. But I would like to bring up just the one point about confiscation, because this is really important, and it ties into our discussion about anarcho-capitalism and we as individuals as to what we can do. You mentioned the U.S. confiscation, but in reality, in the 20th century, gold was confiscated by Lenin in Russia, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Roosevelt in the United States. Why did they do it? If you're going to devalue a dollar or devalue any currency, you don't actually have to confiscate gold. You just give an ounce of gold a higher value in the devaluation. And in fact, I did the calculations for what Roosevelt did in 1933. Instead of confiscating gold, all he had to do is devalue the dollar instead of to $35 to $37, and he would have had that the weight of gold that was in the vault without the confiscation would have equaled the value of the weight of gold in the vault with the confiscation. So why did these guys confiscate gold? They wanted to get free market money out of the hands of the people in order to increase the power of the state. And we've seen how the power of the state has increased throughout the 20th century. This is a reality that we as individuals have to deal with. And it's getting increasingly difficult for individuals to plan for an uncertain future, giving the inroads the state is making. But, in order to sleep well at night, which is everyone's principal objective in terms of knowing that they and their families are protected come what may, it's something that everybody has to be looking at and studying and examining very, very closely.
That brings up one other question I'd like to ask you. Do you think they have the gold that they say they do in Fort Knox?
I'm skeptical. When I was trained as a banker, there had been a big fraud that just occurred in Wall Street back in the 1960s called the DeAngelis salad oil scandal. And this guy was accumulating salad oil in these tanks all around the country. And, the bankers would go lift up the top of the tank and smell the salad oil. And then they would lend, millions of dollars to this guy. Well, it turns out the salad oil was only the top 2 inches of the tank. The rest of the tank was water. I learned as a banker to be very, very skeptical in all of these things. And that's why in Goldmoney we employ third-party independent auditing and testing of all of the gold, because we want to provide our customers with assurances of integrity that their bedrock asset is safe, regardless where they're storing it in the world. And the fact that the U.S. government, and indeed most governments around the world, use phony reporting when they're reporting on their balance sheet, whether they actually own gold and have it in the vault, or the gold is actually put out at risk by lending it to participants in the market. And the fact that there really hasn't been any independent audits of Fort Knox, and we've been misled in so many other ways by the U.S. government in particular, in terms of saying things that were not true or only half-truths, that I remain skeptical as to whether the gold is really there or not. And my point of view is that regardless of whether it's there or not, we as individuals need to own physical gold. And if the gold is not there, there's not going to be any way that the U.S. government's going to be able to reconstruct a monetary system once the dollar collapses. After all, that's what gold is. It was the reserve for currencies. But maybe in the future, governments will finally get out of the monetary business, or the market will force governments to finally get out of the market business, and we'll create a free market where companies can compete on the basis of the rule of law rather than the basis of politics, and using gold as a neutral tool in commerce rather than what it's become in the 20th century is a weapon for political aims.
Yeah, and even if there is gold in Fort Knox, I believe the total value of it at this point in time is around $400 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, which would basically provide 2 months' worth of deficit spending now for the U.S. government. So even if they do have the gold, the fiscal situation is so out of control in the U.S. That gold would only last for 2 months of just deficit spending, not just government spending as a whole, but actual deficit spending.
True, but if they go back to a gold standard at $20,000 an ounce, that same weight of gold becomes a lot more valuable, and therefore, maybe they can keep the game going a little bit longer. But it's going to take, a number over $10,000 an ounce if governments are even remotely thinking about tying their currency to gold, which brings up the whole thing about the platinum coin fiasco that they had in the U.S. I wonder if they realize how close that was to going back to a gold standard, that you take gold and you actually put a value on it and you tie the money creation process to gold. Now, in the case of a platinum coin, which in this case was an extreme example, is no different than putting $1 trillion on a platinum coin than it was when Mugabe was putting $1 trillion on a paper note. But if you go back to gold, historic money, and tie it to the dollar at something like $10 or $15 or $20,000 an ounce, the weight of gold in Fort Knox, assuming it's still there, would be enough to reconstruct a monetary system and do what we did after the war between the states, go back to sound money and go back to the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution, which created sound money for the country in the first place by enshrining gold and silver as money within the Constitution.
Very interesting. I'd like to thank you very much for taking your time today, James.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much. And that's Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.